I bring the greetings of the United Reformed Church in the United Kingdom and give thanks to God for the relationship that our denominations have had over very many years. Thank you for the invitation to speak at this conference. I'm only deeply sorry that the present global pandemic prevents our meeting together in Taiwan, but I also acknowledge that meeting in this way has also lessened the impact of our carbon footprints. Our faith demands very careful stewardship. I take as my title, Continuing in God's Purposes. The genesis of this lecture is in terms of asking the question of returned missionaries. How did working and living in Taiwan influence your later ministry? In most cases, those who worked as missionaries of the Presbyterian Church of England and later the Council for World Mission found themselves in continued ministry, either lay or ordained, on returning to the UK after their work in Taiwan. I am interested in what impact life among fellow Christians, but whose culture and lifestyle were very different, had on my British colleagues. The interest comes out of my own experience as one who was born and educated in the United Kingdom, but who was ordained into the Church of Bangladesh in the early 1970s. In gathering information on this subject, I was originally hampered by the COVID-19 pandemic, in which lockdown prevented face-to-face interviews and access to archives in the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. As lockdown eased, we discovered that my wife had cancer, and so shielding was vital as she takes chemotherapy treatment at the present time. That said, I am grateful for the telephone conversations that have enabled me to gather material for reflection. I base what I have to say on 4 statements made by friends and colleagues with whom I talked. Ours is a generation that saw a significant and vital change in the nature of global mission, particularly through the Council for World Mission. We were probably the last generation to be sent missionaries. In the early 1970s, the African John Gatu made a call for a missionary moratorium. He was the General Secretary of the Presbyterian Church in East Africa, and the call marked an end to the colonial mission paradigm. The year 1975 saw a Council for World Mission conference in which a major decision was made. That is, that we should move from the concept of sending and receiving churches to a fellowship of partnership, of the exchange of personnel between sister, not mother-daughter churches. This had a profound impact on us all and herald, if not immediately a major change, then a potential for change in leadership styles and decision-making in previously receiving churches. Dominant missionaries were to be a thing of the past. I remember asking about a particular medical missionary who served in Africa. She was someone placed on a pedestal by Christians in the United Kingdom. She was highly regarded, a mission hero. "Oh, she was awful," said my missionary colleague, by then a United Reformed Church minister. "She ruled with a rod of iron and would not be gainsaid." Such a working style was said at that time to be the only way that you could get things done. John Gattu was right. His call brought a new understanding of the need for shared responsibility in mutually interdependent partnership. But it may have taken some time in some places to come to fruition. I want to consider these 4 statements and then to reflect on their significance. I shall not name my correspondents, since many of the reflections are my own based on these conversations. They're not their reflections, but I am grateful for the stimulus that they gave. The first sentence is, "I left Taiwan 34 years ago, but Taiwan has never left me." By way of background, I think it's probably the case that members of the United Reformed Church and the erstwhile Presbyterian Church of England in the early post-war years were mainly, but not exclusively, middle class in origin and nature. They were to be found in relatively comfortable suburbs. They had been fortunate to have a good education. They were articulate and experienced in their first professions. 2 of them spoke in terms of usually taking things at face value, as I also had done, not asking too many questions and subscribing to what was to be known much later in IT language as WYSIWYG. What you see is what you get. In the United Kingdom, there was a reasonable chance that one could trust the system. Imagine then what it was like to arrive fresh in Taiwan in the 1960s and 1970s. There is at first the distinct incapacity with regard to language, which means that even the most straightforward daily issues of food, travel, and so on present one with an uphill struggle. Of course, Taiwanese colleagues were always on hand to help and guide, but the immediate feeling is one of a lack of competence and a loss of independence. And it takes some time for such feelings to dissipate. But cultural shock is not confined to oral language. Body language can bring both confusion and embarrassment if you don't get it right. So, for instance, a little thing. Does one clear one's plate at a meal, as one was taught to do in post-war Britain, where no food was to be wasted? Or does one signify that one's host had been wonderfully generous by leaving just a little food uneaten? Where was one to sit at table? How did people greet each other? How did you present your visiting card? I learnt quickly in Taiwan not to give my visiting card with one hand, but with two hands. Social customs can be a minefield of potential and hazardous, unseemly behaviour. Then there is the issue of the temples of other faiths and ideologies. In the 1960s, there was little by way of experience of other faith communities in the United Kingdom. Very few people studied such matters, and even in missionary training, negative attitudes often prevailed. Thus, a missionary was expected to see the Taiwanese as other, as heathen, as benighted, and in abject darkness. After all, were these people not the ones to be seen as targets of missionary conversion? And if one was a teacher, how was one to teach? In the little experience I had of teaching in Taiwan when I was a guest, I gained the impression that Confucian understanding encouraged one to respect the teacher, and therefore it was the teacher's job to provide the answers. My attempts to encourage students to work things out for themselves backfired because of the potential embarrassment of giving the wrong answer. So students kept quiet. There was a distinct culture clash. As time went on, those who had been fairly uncritically accepting by nature amongst my missionary friends began to find questions arising in their minds. Who could you trust? Why am I being constantly monitored and under surveillance? What can I say? Will my actions undermine the reputation and safety of the church? Some of my correspondents arrived in Taiwan just as Dan and Joyce Beebe were being forced to leave. A new hermeneutic of suspicion arose in people's minds. And so, on returning to the United Kingdom after years of service in Taiwan, these people were confronted by the recognition that one was beginning to view life through quite different lenses. Years of behaviour influenced by cultural practice meant that one dealt with people in a different manner. The poverty that some in the medical profession had seen as they went into villages forced one, on returning, to recognise the need for the struggle for justice, the importance of not taking our National Health Service for granted, the commitment to establish a fairer deal for all was foremost in her mind. Of course, you don't need to leave your own country to make such commitments, but living abroad heightens awareness and determination. For many, the experience of Taiwan widened their understanding of the gospel. What is so striking of the church in Taiwan is that it is involved in all aspects of life, whether that be medicine or education or agriculture or care for the young people or care for the elderly, and so on. One is confronted as a missionary by the gospel being lived and being practical, being pragmatic. One is confronted by the dignity of a serving ministry and by the church's costly involvement in the call for justice and integrity in social and political life. Many of the people whom I interviewed had great admiration for the fact that the Presbyterian Church of Taiwan had issued the Statement of Our National Fate in 1971, and years later, in 1985, had published the Confession of Faith of the Presbyterian Church in Taiwan. Now, whilst back in the United Kingdom, the United Reformed Church had certainly spoken out against injustice. This was not to replicate the costly nature of Taiwanese discipleship, where the struggle could result in imprisonment and in persecution. In the 1960s, in Britain, a book was published under the title The Comfortable Pew. We who returned to the West recognized how our home churches were more likely to support the comfortable status quo than to campaign for a world order closer to the nature of the reign of God. Returning home was a mixed blessing, because on returning home, one also saw things through new eyes. One was more aware of what nowadays we call political spin or fake news. One no longer viewed life with uncritical eyes. Settling down again was difficult. Now one had another language, another set of perceptions and worldviews, another culture in terms of music and art. One lived astride two cultures and had to ask, who and what am I? I, as an entity, was now something far greater than I had been. My being was caught up in the being of others. The communion service became a celebration not only of our unity with God, but with our fellow Christians in another part of the world. I was part of the body of Christ, playing my role amidst others who also brought their capabilities and their talents. My salvation could no longer be narrowly individualistic, but was caught up with all God's creation, awaiting, as Paul says, its own salvation. I move to reflect on another person's experience. She said quite openly, I grew up in Taiwan. I grew up in Taiwan. As I was starting my first job as a presbyter of the Church of Bangladesh, another colleague of the same age was taking up a new post in the Presbyterian Church in Taiwan, working as a nurse. She used this phrase, I grew up in Taiwan. It was not that she was inexperienced in her work. Neither was she immature. It was much more a question of finding oneself. So what does this mean? We were both in our mid-20s, and to some extent beginning to break away from the worldviews and even the prejudices of our parents, those around us, and those who taught us. We were entering into a new environment where one is challenged to reconsider that which we had previously taken for granted. The place of women and their role was changing considerably in no less a place than missionary circles. An illustration of this was the change made in referencing the wives of missionaries in the Presbyterian Church of England's yearbook. For many years, single women missionaries were mentioned by name. But the wives of male missionaries were signified simply by an asterisk. That's all, an asterisk. It didn't matter if they played a major role wherever they were stationed, they were simply an asterisk. One missionary wife spoke of her objection to this in General Assembly. I am not an asterisk, she said. I am a star. Women in mission were now taking on roles of responsibility. My colleague was first employed as a nurse, but pointed out that so much more could be done to prevent ill health if she worked as a health worker, regularly visiting villages in the vicinity of the Presbyterian Church of Taiwan hospital in which she worked. A few weeks later, she was actually allowed to take up that role. It was an important insight into mission practice, a move from expecting people to come to us to going to them. Of course, this was nothing new. St. Paul's ministry was of that nature. But it was an important break from the mission compound mentality espoused by our forebears. That same friend of mine lived in a house outside the mission compound. She lived amongst the Am Haaretz, as the Hebrew phrase has it, the people of the land, just as Jesus spent his time with the people of the land. She became herself, confident in her ability, striking out to make friends with those among whom she lived outside the mission compound. Further, conversations with neighbours opened up opportunities to speak about the gospel without imposing it or forcing the conversation. More significantly, she indicated that words cannot take the place of love and care. Here were shades of the concept of witness to the gospel and, if necessary, use words. Finding oneself is also about finding one's roots. In the case of many missionaries in Taiwan, one becomes both less and more British, embracing a strange dichotomy in which one finds the importance of one's own language and culture, but also recognises the importance of the culture of the host society. This was particularly evident for a colleague who is Welsh. She and her husband were brought up bilingually and had to experience the resurgence of Welsh in Wales itself. For decades, English had been forced on the Welsh people as the language of education. One was forbidden to speak one's mother tongue in the classroom. My dad had a sign put over his neck, and it read, "No Welsh." You weren't allowed to speak your own language in the classroom. And I was fascinated to see the way in which the Presbyterian Church of Taiwan, without realizing it, was taking up the same role with regard to Taiwanese as the Presbyterian Church of Wales had taken up with regard to Welsh. Both churches were determined not to let those languages be lost. And yet, here was a major dilemma. What language was the missionary to learn? Most learned Mandarin, the language encouraged by the government. But it meant that missionaries often did not always understand what was going on in synod meetings they attended, because the language of those meetings was Taiwanese. Yet Mandarin was becoming the lingua franca of the island, and as such, the medium of the communication of the gospel. Similarly, it was the language used in university chaplaincy. My Welsh colleagues found themselves torn because they could see the potential for the loss of a language and culture, as had nearly been the case in Wales. Issues of this nature challenge one to think again about one's own roots and culture. Growing up is not just a matter of chronological age. It is a matter of vision and understanding, of the capacity to deal with conflict, both in outside life and also within one's own mind. Such issues come to play as one finds oneself taking on new responsibilities. Those of us whose early work experience took them overseas to sister churches soon found ourselves taking on responsibilities at an age which would have been considered too young in the home country. It was part of the legacy of missionary work. The missionary was seen as the one in charge, irrespective of age and experience. With this came privilege and prized accommodation. But things were changing. One returned missionary spoke warmly not only of the burgeoning move towards equality, but spoke of the fine leadership evidenced in post-war years. Perhaps this came about because the newer post-war missionaries did not sit apart from Taiwanese colleagues in synods, as had previously been the case amongst missionaries, but they committed themselves to associating with their Taiwanese colleagues and recognizing themselves as supportive colleagues and not directing superiors, not as the boss people. That same returned missionary who spoke of growing up also said something else of significance. She returned to the United Kingdom to take up further studies, but was invited back with the words, "We'll find you something to do." Now this at first glance may be very encouraging, that one's presence and one's abilities are valued. But there's another side to this coin. I believe that missionary work usually needs specific purpose with one's function clearly defined. Mission history shows that there have been people whose lives have been frustrated by their being transported thousands of miles away only to find they had no specific purpose and consequently no real fulfillment. This has particularly been the case for married couples where one partner's skills have been well used and valued, but the other partner has sometimes wondered about his or her own purpose. That said, one also has to recognize that being too prescriptive about the missionary's function can stifle the Holy Spirit as an alternative form of service is discovered and developed. Careful and prayerful thought must be given to the nature of the invitation and the call. And so, what of the return to the United Kingdom after missionary service? Given the responsibilities taken on whilst serving in Taiwan, it is hardly surprising that some who have returned have found themselves in leadership positions within the church, either in terms of responsibility for ecumenical relationships or church administration, or in terms of taking ordination. Significantly, 3 women colleagues later felt called to and trained for ordained ministry. They brought to their ministries a wider perspective developed by their experience in Asia at a time when some in Britain were challenged by what they saw as growing numbers of immigrants in their cities. These colleagues, like many returned missionaries, were able to act as bridges, fostering mutual understanding and thus enabling the breaking down of racism that is so often to be found within the United Kingdom. It is not without significance that the Reverend Dr. Boris Anderson was one of the pioneers of encouraging interfaith dialogue in the United Kingdom. This was not simply within the United Reformed Church, where with one of my predecessors in Bangladesh, Boris worked to establish the Mission and Other Faiths Committee. But also Boris was instrumental in the creation of the Committee for Relations with People of Other Faiths of the British Council of Churches, as it then was. It may seem a paradox that two erstwhile missionaries may have been involved in interfaith dialogue, but these were the very people who were capable of bringing the tools of reconciliation in an environment of potential division. Experience of the costliness of discipleship in Taiwan also brought one of the returnees, I should say, training for ministry, to reflect on what she saw as the oversimplification of the gospel and the naivety amongst her peers and teachers at her British Theological College. That naivety seems simply to say that believe in Jesus, give thanks for God's love, and all would be well. The reality of the hardships of life seemed to be overlooked. In Taiwan, my colleague had developed a theology of resilience. Life is not easy or straightforward. Lousy things do happen. It was if, in this country, the gospel was about Easter Sunday, without the suffering that is Good Friday. One wonders if Christianity in the West overlooks this vital element in the gospel story. Now, at this point, I need to bring an observation made by another colleague. She said, I saw the importance of doing the little things with great love. I saw the importance of doing the little things with great love. She and I are Welsh. The patron saint of Wales is St. David, who is reputed to have said, Gwnewch y pethau bychan. It means, do the little things. It's said that in the days of the early church, the gospel was spread as much by the ordinary Christian folk as by the big name apostles. These latter people may have been articulate in terms of speaking about Jesus and establishing an early theological understanding of his being. But it was ordinary Christians who lived the way that Jesus lived, whose openness and care for others impressed their neighbours and their friends. When asked what it was that impressed her in terms of the life of Christians in Taiwan. One colleague said it was the recognition of the importance of simply walking with people. And it is that preposition with that is equally important in an understanding that one works with people and not for people. Many of my informants had returned to the United Kingdom by the time of the horrendous earthquake of September the 21st, 1999. But what struck them was the way in which the Presbyterian Church of Taiwan responded to that traumatic event. It happened 3 days after one of my own British ministerial students arrived in Tainan Theological College. What impressed her was the way in which the whole college simply closed down and went to the most devastated areas, offering what support they could. At a time when everything feels utterly uncertain, very often it is the small acts of kindness that can make such a big difference. Helping in the search for survivors, cooking food, building temporary shelter, offering a listening ear, comforting the sick and the bereaved. These are ordinary, simple matters which can be done by you and me. They don't require extraordinary skills. They are the ordinary things of which St. David speaks, and they are done with love, with great love. Students and staff then put themselves out to help. They could have stayed in college, but actually they couldn't have stayed in college. Their faith prompted the need for a response, drove them to help and serve others. Newly arrived in Taiwan, my British student had been full of homesickness and not a little fear. As she helped in the struggle to rebuild broken families and homes, she learnt the real nature of Christian care and compassion, where service before self is the key word. Homesickness? There wasn't any time for that. What really impressed our student was the systematic way in which the Presbyterian Church in Taiwan responded. There were 3 stages. The first was to visit the disaster areas, distributing much needed resources and, where necessary, money. The second stage, covering the remaining part of 1999, was to conduct memorial services, build prefabricated houses, and provide spiritual and counselling services. And the third stage was to last some 4 years, during which time the Community Recuperation and Care Centre project enabled victims to rebuild their stricken communities. Here was the church founded on James Maxwell's holistic mission, replicating his work and providing selfless service, which was not without its dangers. Selfless service and risk was nothing new to the Presbyterian Church of Taiwan. The stories of selfless missionary giving by such as the Lansborough family over 2 generations were well known amongst their fellow Taiwanese Christians. And in differing but similar ways, such witness was to be found amongst Presbyterian Church in Taiwan members. My colleagues recognised the importance of ministry within the community as a means of Christian mission and witness. Unless the church has built a good interaction with the local community, its mission cannot be implemented adequately. It is vital to establish trust and transparency. I find a preoccupation with church growth to be dangerous, where church growth is simply sought for the sake of growing numbers. I believe the church's purpose is not maintenance of its own existence and expansion. Its purpose, I would argue, is its involvement in the establishment of the reign of God in this world. When that happens and is valued, then growth occurs. We must ask ourselves, what is our motivation? If it is ecclesiastical self-aggrandizement, then perhaps we've failed to understand the nature of the church's function. One has to escape from a church-centric mindset. Equally important is the manner in which Christians were seen to be dealing with people. Those who had been involved in medicine as doctors or health workers recognized that their function was not simply curing people, but curing and caring, irrespective of status. On returning to the United Kingdom, one found herself wanting to work with fellow Christians in a local Christian medical practice because their faith guided their care for the community. Another colleague returned to work as a healthcare worker in an area of social deprivation. Her capability to meet people where they are, irrespective of status and in a non-judgmental manner, was something that she had developed in Taiwan. And it meant that she was trusted and appreciated and felt at ease with those often rejected by comfortable Christians, such as the prostitutes who sought her help. That is, she was at ease with the prostitutes, not so much with the comfortable Christians. The gospel is open to all. The fourth statement by an erstwhile missionary, which struck me forcefully, was that the Taiwanese church was a willing sacrifice. In the United Kingdom in 1980, we read with admiration of the manner in which the Reverend Dr. Siam Gao was prepared to face jail because of his advocacy of human rights and democracy, and his willingness to help Xi Mingde because of his involvement in the 1979 Kaohsiung incident. The Presbyterian Church of Taiwan had developed a strong sense of the importance of democracy, in no small measure thanks to the influence of missionaries. My wife and I were at Selly Oak Colleges at the time when the Reverend Dr. Dan Beebe and his wife Joyce arrived, having been forced to leave Tainan because of Dan's advocacy of democracy. Political consciousness was never far from the minds of those at Tainan Seminary. During the days of occupation, Japanese occupation, the college was closed rather than accept a Japanese principle, and many were imprisoned or beaten because they gave the so-called wrong answer to the question, which is greater, Jesus or our emperor? At a later stage, in post-war years, many government officials did not realise the way in which Boris Anderson's wife Claire had been quietly involved in making students aware of the nature of democracy. A classics graduate, she taught Greek texts, which seemed quite innocuous, but in fact they were about democracy, and it is said by some that the Presbyterian Church was one of the few places in Taiwan where the nature of democracy was properly understood and experienced, in that congregational representatives met together, discussed, voted, and abided by a majority decision. This understanding of mission work in Taiwan, being related to the whole person, must be seen within the context of the fact that the first Presbyterian missionary to Taiwan was James Maxwell, who was a doctor who healed as well as preached. St. Mark's Gospel especially emphasizes Jesus' healing as well as his preaching ministry. And whilst the medical work of the Presbyterian Church in Taiwan has been rightly emphasized, one has also to recognize the courses at Tainan for kindergarten training and music and social work studies. One Presbyterian minister once said that more people join the church through being attracted to church choirs than as a result of evangelistic campaigns. The Presbyterian Church in Taiwan rightly has a proud history of standing up for justice and integrity, whether it was in terms of the maintenance of Taiwanese identity during the days of Japanese occupation or during the Second World War, when the church was alone, when survival took great courage and faith and wisdom. There is no doubt that we in the United Kingdom must pay our respects to our sister church and thank God for the heroism of our fellow Christians. Little wonder then that there were times when, on returning to the United Kingdom, many missionaries were dissatisfied with the introversion of our home church, with its preoccupation with itself and its own continued existence. This, of course, is not the case for all British Christians, but probably reflects the concern about the decline in church attendance on the part of the majority, and the spiritual search more for salvation of the individual rather than the liberation of one's whole being and its relationship to fellow human beings and creation. So let me begin to reflect on the implications of the experiences my colleagues had. Those of us who had been privileged to work with our fellow Christians in different parts of the world have so often had our eyes opened to different ways of witnessing to the gospel, and very often the difficulties of living in an environment that did not necessarily welcome the challenge that is inherent in the Christian faith. We talk of the gospel as good news, and that it is. Yet the inherent demands that it makes for selflessness and justice, integrity and equality are not good news to some. So to speak of such a gospel can bring difficulties and persecution, and over the years the Presbyterian Church in Taiwan has experienced this. But it has also experienced appreciation and support for its witness and faithfulness. There's much that we in the West, the erstwhile sending churches, can learn from our partners. Let me look at church practice. For generations, the churches in the West exported the gospel packaged in Western culture. And I illustrate this from a story from one of my Methodist students who was being driven along a road in Kenya when he came across a clapboard church which looked every bit like a New England church building. He thought this indicated the influence of American missionaries, but no, it wasn't the work of American missionaries, but Korean ones. They'd been taught what a proper church building looks like, and in their turn insisted the same design be used in Africa. There's no recognition of the African climate and subsequent architectural styles. That's one side of the Christian baggage. Another side is that Huang Po-ho makes an interesting analysis of the development of theology in Taiwan, indicating 4 distinct periods. From 1865 to 1950, the receiving period, when Taiwan was seen as the land of mission, with the church pretty much under the governance of Western missionary societies. And mission was about dissemination of Western Christian teachings. which were in effect alien to Taiwanese society. The second period was from the General Assembly of 1951, when Taiwanese Christians were encouraged to recognise church growth movement, particularly amongst the less affluent in the land. The third period started in 1971 with the statement of our national fate, awakening PCT members to involvement in the struggle caused by their social political predicament. And the fourth period started with the issuing of the Confession of Faith of the Presbyterian Church in Taiwan, where the Christian faith was expressed in truly contextual terms. It was a time when the church came of age, and theology was not confined to individual spirituality, but it encouraged and enhanced critical awareness of the gospel's challenge to the whole of our daily lives. Small wonder then that my erstwhile missionary colleague spoke of the naivety of both staff and students when she underwent training for ministry in the United Kingdom. And as I come to think of it, my own college did not really explore contextual theology until the 1990s. My colleague Li Hao-tiong indicates very rightly that the living word, that the text needs to be transformed into the living word. To this end, one is involved in grassroots living. And my colleagues who returned to the United Kingdom were involved in this when they became people involved in the local medical practice, or as one did, when she became a greeter in one of the local supermarkets. We have to recognise that all this is part not of the church's mission, I don't like that phrase, but is part of God's mission, the Missio Dei. That is what must demonstrate our practice. That was learnt through the work of the Presbyterian Church in Taiwan. And that is what my colleagues found when they worked in Taiwan itself. The Presbyterian Church in Taiwan has reflected, it seems to me, the natural characteristics of the Reformed tradition. We exist through God's grace alone. We exist through faith, our faithful response to trusting in God's grace. We exist recognizing that the scripture is our only real, authentic element of instruction. We recognize that all our work must be done to the glory of God, Soli Deo Gloria. And we also recognize, like the Presbyterian Church in Taiwan, that the Reformed Church must keep on reforming, responding to the environment which it finds itself in. I give thanks to God that this is what my missionary colleagues have done, and this has been what my missionary colleagues have continued to do over the years since they left Taiwan. May God grant us all grace to follow his will and to be directly involved in his mission.